All right, let's dive right into some pretty wild weather. We've got this article. It's from NASA's Earth Observatory, and it's called How Extreme Rainfall Transformed Tennessee and Kentucky Overnight. You know those, like, before and after pictures, the ones that just make you stop and stare? Well, these satellite pictures in this article are exactly like that. I mean, we're talking fields turned into lakes, rivers just bursting out of their banks. It's pretty intense.
Yeah, and you know what really gets me is that it's not just, showing the damage after everything's happened. It's almost like seeing the storm happening in real time. We can really see like how fast the landscape changed, and that's something we haven't always been able to do.
Right, and the article even mentions how this storm dumped 6 inches of rain. 6 inches, that's like filling a whole bathtub in less than 2 days, but spread out over, like, whole towns in the countryside.
Yeah, and the article also goes into how they use the special technique with the satellite picture, and, to make the flooding really clear. They call it a false color image using the 754 band combination. Have you ever thought about how our eyes actually see color? It's all based on how different wavelengths of light, bounce off or get absorbed by stuff. So these satellites, they use similar ideas, but capture wavelengths that are way beyond what we can see.
So it's like giving the satellite, like, supervision or something to see what we can't.
Yeah, exactly. And by mixing these specific wavelengths, the 754 bands, they can make the flooded areas just jump out of the image. They almost glow this weird blue color because of all the stuff the water's carrying.
So it's not just about making a pretty picture then. It's like giving scientists a really powerful way to understand exactly what's going on, right?
Absolutely. And that info is so important for everything from, predicting future floods to even helping out with disaster relief efforts.
And speaking of that, the article zooms in on this small town in Tennessee called Rives. This town got hit really bad when a levee broke. Like, over half the homes were damaged. Can you imagine what that must be like for that community?
It's just heartbreaking, It really hits home how much these events cost in terms of people's lives. It's easy to get lost in all the scientific details, but we have to remember that behind all that data, there are real people whose lives are being turned upside down, sometimes, forever.
The article talks about a USGS gauge in Obion, Tennessee, that recorded the water level at almost 40 feet. That's way higher than the 34-foot flood stage. Can you explain, like, why that number is so important?
Okay, so think of a river like a container, like it's slowly getting filled up, right? The flood stage is kind of like marking a line on that container. When the water reaches that line, it means the river can't hold all that water anymore, and it starts spilling out, flooding all the land around it. And the higher the water goes above that line, the worse the flooding gets, more widespread and just more damaging.
So in this case, the water was 6 feet above that line. That's crazy. It really makes you think about just how much water was involved.
Yeah, and what's really scary is that this kind of intense rain is happening more and more often. It's not a matter of if these extreme events will happen again, it's when.
And that brings up another point from the article. Western Kentucky also had some bad flooding, but the satellite pictures couldn't show it because of cloud cover.
Right, and it's important to remember that satellite pictures are super useful, but they're not perfect. There are always going to be things they can't see, like when there are clouds. That's why it's so important to have lots of different sources of information, like reports from people on the ground and stuff.
So it's like getting a full picture from the satellite, from the data, and from people who are actually there.
Exactly, and by putting all that together, we can start to understand just how big and impactful these events are.
And if you think the flooding was bad enough, there's another twist to this whole thing. The article says there's this freezing cold snap and maybe even a snowstorm heading right for those flooded areas. Talk about adding insult to injury, huh?
Yeah, and that brings a whole other set of problems to the table. Not only are we dealing with the flooding itself, but now we're looking at frozen pipes bursting, power going out, and just really hard conditions for rescue and recovery efforts.
So it's like this one area is getting hit with two weather disasters back to back. First, all that crazy rain, and now they have to deal with freezing temps and snow. How do people even begin to, get ready for something like that?
Well, that's the big question, and it shows how connected all these weather systems really are. What might seem like separate things, like flooding, then a cold snap, are actually linked together in all sorts of complicated ways. And since we're seeing more and more of these kinds of compound events, the way we prepare for disasters has to change too.
So we can't just think about preparing for one type of disaster at a time. We have to think about those domino effects, how one extreme event can set off a chain reaction of other problems.
Exactly. And that's where the article stories on climate change comes in. Even though we can't say any single weather event is directly because of climate change, which we know it's making these extreme events more likely to happen in the first place.
So it's like climate change is making it more likely we'll roll those extreme weather dice, right?
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just the amount of rain either. It's also the timing and how intense it is. We're seeing more of these super sudden downpours, storms, just massive amounts of rain that completely overwhelm drainage systems and lead to flash flooding. It's like trying to pour a gallon of water into a tiny little shot glass. It just can't handle it.
So climate change is basically making these events worse, more sudden, and just way more overwhelming. It makes you wonder how we can even adapt to that. I mean, what can we do?
Well, there are a few key things we can poke you for. One is investing in tougher, more resilient infrastructure. That means upgrading our drainage systems so they can handle way more water, reinforcing those levees, and having better warning systems that give people more time to prepare.
So it's about anticipating these extreme events and building stuff that can handle them. But what about the bigger picture? How do we even start to fix the root of the problem, climate change itself?
Yeah, that's where things get tricky, but it's also where the biggest opportunity lies. Reducing those greenhouse gas emissions is absolutely key. That means switching over to renewable energy sources, making everything more energy efficient, and finding ways to make transportation more sustainable. We also need to rethink how we use land, especially in areas that are prone to flooding. Protecting wetlands and restoring natural floodplains can help soak up that extra water and lessen the impact of these events.
So it sounds like a multi-pronged attack, dealing with the symptoms by having better infrastructure and then tackling the underlying cause by fighting climate change.
Exactly, and it's not just about governments and big organizations taking action. Individuals can make a difference too. We can all reduce our own carbon footprint by doing things like driving less, using energy-efficient appliances, and supporting businesses that care about sustainability.
So it sounds like everyone has a role to play, from the choices we make every day to big policy changes. It can seem overwhelming, but it's good to know there are things we can do to help.
Absolutely. And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about these events and what's causing them, the better decisions we can make and the more effective our actions will be.
So on that note, what are some of the key takeaways you'd want listeners to remember from our deep dive today?
I think the biggest takeaway is that these extreme weather events aren't something that might happen in the future. They're happening now. And they're only going to get more frequent and more intense as climate change keeps going.
So we need to be ready for a future where these events are the new normal.
Exactly. We have to shift our thinking. It's not just about reacting to disasters after they happen. It's about being proactive and reducing the risks. And that starts with understanding the science behind these events, how climate change is affecting them, and what we can do to adapt and build resilience.
What about the human side of things? We've talked about damaged homes and people's lives being disrupted. But what are the longer-term effects of these events, especially for communities that get hit by flooding over and over again?
That's a really important point. The economic damage from repeated flooding can be absolutely devastating. Businesses might have to close, property values go way down, and entire communities struggle to recover. It can create this cycle of poverty and displacement, especially for those who are already the most vulnerable.
So it's not just about the immediate damage, but these ripple effects that keep impacting communities for years.
Exactly, and this brings up another big question. How do we balance economic development with protecting the environment? Can we build in a way that's good for the economy, but also can withstand the impacts of climate change?
That sounds like a really tough balancing act, especially in a world where, making money often comes before protecting the environment.
It is a challenge, but I think it's one we can overcome. We're seeing more and more examples of communities and businesses finding creative solutions, solution that builds sustainability and resilience right into how they operate. It's about realizing that a healthy environment is essential for long-term economic success.
That's a pretty hopeful way to look at it. It's not about choosing between the economy or the environment. It's about making them work together so everyone benefits.
Exactly, and that takes a change in how we think, recognizing that everything is connected, people, the planet, and the economy.
Well, this deep dive has really got me thinking about how everything is connected. It's amazing how we started talking about satellite pictures of flooding and ended up discussing the economy, human resilience, and even the future of our planet. Yeah, it really shows how something that seems isolated, like a storm in Tennessee and Kentucky, can actually have these much bigger effects.
Absolutely. It reminds us that what happens in one place can affect us all. We're all connected in this big system, and we need to start thinking and acting like it.
So bringing you back to where we started with those amazing satellite images and the story of Rise, Tennessee, what would you say is the most important thing for people to take away from all this?
Well, I think the flooding in Tennessee and Kentucky is like a big wake-up call. We're seeing climate change happening right now, right in front of us. And while it might seem kind of scary, I think it's also a call to action, We have the knowledge, the technology, even the resources to deal with these challenges.
So it's not about just giving up. It's about turning that worry into something positive, into action.
Exactly. It's about understanding that we're not just watching this happen. We can actually do something about it. And that starts with making smart choices, both as individuals and as a society.
And that brings us back to that cold snap and possible snowstorm heading right towards the areas that are already flooded. How do you think that's going to affect things?
Oh, it's definitely going to make things a lot harder. We could see frozen pipes bursting, roads getting blocked, and rescue efforts getting slowed down by snow and ice. It's a situation that'll really push our infrastructure and our ability to respond to the limit.
And what about the people who've already had to leave their homes because of the flooding? Where do they go when the temperature drops and it starts snowing?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It really shows how important it is to have strong disaster plans and systems that can handle these more and more complicated events. We need to be thinking about how to provide shelter, keep people warm, and get them the help they need in these situations.
This deep dive has really been eye-opening. We've covered so much, from the science behind these extreme weather events to how it affects people and what we can do about it. So what's one final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, I'd say this. The challenges we face are big, but we can handle them. Throughout history, human ingenuity and resilience have always found ways to overcome tough times. And this time is no different. We have the knowledge, the tools, and the will to create a more sustainable and resilient future. It's up to each of us to step up and be a part of that solution.
That's a great message to end on. A reminder that even with all these challenges, there's still hope, and we still have time to act.
Exactly. And it all starts with understanding. The more we know about these events, the better decisions we can make, and the more we can do to make a difference.
So to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of extreme weather. We hope you've learned something new about these complex events and that you feel inspired to be part of the solution. Remember, knowledge is power. Use it wisely.